Well, hello again, everybody. Shalom, shalom to yet another edition of Stump the Stars Jewish Style, where we give it our best shot in answering the questions you have raised, either by way of email, hopefully, so that we're a little better prepared, or the questions that arise as part of our interaction together this evening. And, of course, those who join us later, by all means, for future editions of Stump the Stars Jewish Style, make sure you send in your questions to stumpthestars@gmail.com. That being said, let's get started by talking to God, and then we'll launch into our session this evening. Thank you, Father, that you've given us yet another opportunity to get together. Thank you for the way you've watched over us over the previous weeks, and the way you will continue to do so in the days ahead. And so we'd ask for a real productive session this evening, real clarity in understanding the questions as well as responding to them, but more importantly that our interactions this evening will change our lives in such a way that we be more effective in interacting with those around us and in attracting those around us to an encounter with the God of the universe through Yeshua our Messiah. Because of whom we say, thank you. Amen. All right. As is our usual custom, anybody in the room, if you have any questions?
Jesse does. No? No, because I already sent them in.
Yes,
Okay.
Jesse has sent them in, and I've got them right in front of me. Anybody, well, a couple of you that we're looking at on the monitor, you've also sent in questions. So I guess we'll just launch into the questions that we have. All right, we'll do this again basically in the order in which we received them. Now, this first one has multiple parts to it, and we'll try to take it part by part. But before we even launch, Patrice has a book that relates to some conversation we had, I think, the last time we were together.
The last time we were together, and this is about that special color blue that is used nowadays in modern times on the Israeli flag. Is considered a special color blue with its own name, and it was used as the blue thread that went through the fringes that were put on Jewish people's garments, like he has. See, it's not just white threads; they have a blue thread that is included in the weaving of the tzitzit. These are tzitzit. The tassels are tzitzit, and anymore, nowadays, the vast majority of tzitzit are pure white. And the reasoning is that they were not sure, the Jewish community, the leadership was not sure what that special blue was that became finally known as royal blue. They knew that it was a natural dye. It was not, concocted in a laboratory. But it occurred naturally in nature. And so about 10 years ago, this book was written, and I just couldn't remember the name of it. It's called The Rarest Blue, like R-A-R-E-S-T, The Rarest Blue, written by a husband and wife team, Israelis, where the husband is a physicist and a scientist in general, and the special color blue, it has its own name. It's techelet. In Hebrew, if you're talking about any old blue, you would say kahol. But techelet is its own name. It has its own name and is identified as probably closest to what we would know as royal blue. And he performed all the experiments on various shellfish, various plants, animals. He based it a lot on what has been done in the past, which is a lot of work depending on who you are, but believes that he has found the actual color techelet. And here there's pictures in it. It's not a long book. There's a lot of white text, and you can see all different colors. And it's not just that it's the shellfish. It is a shellfish that they process the color out of by laying it out in the hot sun and like semi-boiling it until The dye is released from this shell, and that's how. So, for those of you who are interested in what actually is that color, blue techelet, it's summarized in this book. It's a great book. I'm sorry, did somebody ask a question?
Okay. And in honor of that introduction, you can look at my shirt for various shades and possibilities, and our Stump the Stars file folder.
That's very close to techelet.
Yeah.
But again, if a teacher in a classroom is asking you what color is that poster, you will say kahol. You will not say techelet. Techelet is like it's not a holy word, but it's suitable for only one thing.
Sort of a technical term, would you call it?
Yes.
Okay. We wanted to get that to you since there was a question related to the importance of that particular color.
Oh, I was going to say,
Oh,
their,
yeah.
their last name is Stearman, Sterman.
Okay.
That would be helpful to have,
Yes.
along with the title.
And
It's published
He-
by Lyons Press, Lyons Press.
and interestingly enough, the guy's first name, most appropriately, is Baruch.
Is Baruch.
So he and his wife did that and gave us that insight. And by the way, this particular, there are now sources for this particular color, blue, from a couple places that have worked on this, including what used to be called the Temple Institute. They have a more specific technical name now in Jerusalem, and you can get seat with techelet as part of it. Anyhow, now to the question from, gosh, this is a month ago. I heard an argument that the laws of the Torah were exclusionary, separating Jew from Gentile, and those that were deemed unclean from the rest of society. One aspect of this was the idea that the laws of the Torah said you could not go to or into a Gentile's home. I have seen no such law in Scripture. And by the way, let me pause briefly to reflect on that. The reason the questioner has not seen such a law in Scripture is because, guess what? There is no such law in Scripture that a Jew could not go into a Gentile's home. There was also the exclusion of those that were lepers and women who were on their time of month from society. Now then there's a related question, but let me pause long enough to deal with the aspects that are here. Hold on, let me just see if I want to go further. No, let me go into the next paragraph as well. To my knowledge, it was not specifically leprosy, but non-specific contagious sin diseases that were a cause for quarantine and examination by the priest. That was to protect the health of others and prevent the spread of such diseases. Also, the state of impurity could be remedied by going through the mikveh. And again, that is correct. So just as someone could become unclean, they could also become clean again. Finally, in books like Exodus and Ruth, and I will add the book of Joshua as well, we have Gentiles joining the Jewish community, especially the mixed multitude. The mixed multitude was what was a term that described the group that left Egypt.
In other words, Gentiles left Egypt with the Jews.
Yeah.
They chose to leave Egypt, and they went with the Jews.
And so the last statement is, so I fail to see how this is exclusionary. And again, that is correct. As Patrice has already suggested, when the people left Egypt, when the Jewish people left Egypt, it wasn't just Jewish people that left. There were Egyptians who joined them, and that's why it was called a mixed multitude, because it wasn't just Jews. Now, why might this have occurred? Well, think about it for a bit. When you look at the book of Exodus, one of the things that God says is, I'm going to bring these signs and wonders, these plagues on these people, so what? Just for the sake of pure judgment, because I'm the God of the Old Testament who's so judgy, who's so judgmental. No, he says, I'm doing these things so that you might know, and the people of Egypt might know that I am the Lord. the only God.
And not Pharaoh.
And specifically, not just in not Pharaoh,
And his
but
family.
I was going to say, and also the other gods of Egypt,
Yeah.
as well as the gods that were surrounding those particular nations. That the purpose was that they might know that the Lord, He is God, as we say under the Shema, and He alone. Well, guess what? Some Egyptians got the point. And so they did three things. Number one, I'm going to guess that, although the text doesn't say this, I'm going to guess that some of them did actually sacrifice a Passover lamb, or what we call the Passover lamb, and protected their firstborn. Some of them certainly gave gifts to the Jews as they were leaving.
A lot of Egyptians did.
A lot of Egyptians did that. Now, was it just to say, here, take this and get out of here as quick as you can, so you're no longer a bother to us, or take this because this is what you deserve because what our people have done to you, or take this because your God is the right God and this is our way of responding to Him. For whatever reason, they gave gifts, they gave stuff to the Jewish people as they left. And then some of them actually left with the Jewish people because they wanted to continue to connect with the God whom they had seen demonstrate Himself as God. So, right from the outset, it was not exclusionary. I want to take it a step back further. Abraham is noted in Jewish tradition for having made, for lack of a better term, a lot of converts from those around him. Why? Because he was continually talking or demonstrating to people around him the nature of the God who called him to this specific covenant. We talked about that covenant as part of the Drash last night. A very significant covenant that would, according to Genesis 12, impact not only Jewish people but Gentiles as well. Abraham got the point, and he was known for his hospitality, and because of his hospitality there were people who connected with him and who became part of the followers of God, of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, as we come to know him. So, non-exclusionary from the outset. And in fact, the interesting thing is the Torah itself is inclusionary, if I want to use that term, because it was intended to, back to when it was given, Exodus chapter 19, God says to the people, I want you to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Now, if the whole of the Jewish people were priests, who were they priests for? Obviously, they were intended to be priests, to serve as priests to the surrounding nations, so they could communicate God to the surrounding nations and could stand on behalf of the surrounding nations before God. So, from the beginning, very inclusionary. The question points out, so much for the book of Exodus, now going back into Genesis as well. The book of Ruth, Patrice has spoken on it many times. Do you want to elaborate at all on that?
What part of Ruth do you want me to elaborate on?
On her becoming
part of the
Yeah.
nation.
Yeah.
So, what then happened with the mixed multitude? What then happened to these Gentiles who joined up with the Jews and were taken into the desert, where there were no population centers? There were oases, but they were not cities or towns. Well, if you set out on your own from the multitude, I don't think you could count on living very long. Some people never think about the implications of what they're saying. So if these Gentiles were kicked out because they weren't Jewish, that would be probably recorded in the scriptures for us. But as far as we know, the people who arrived at Gilgal, right outside of Jericho, under the leadership of Joshua, they were all considered Jews. Well, what happened? What's going on here? How can you be 39 years prior, they were Gentiles, and now that they're all Jews. How did that work out? Well, it's called conversion. And just because it's not mentioned doesn't mean that it wasn't developed yet. Now, it may not look anything like conversion to Judaism that we have today. It may be something a little akin to a family would adopt you or adopt your family, and then you would become a member of that tribe. Or perhaps you are single, you left as a single person, you fell in love with someone who's in a tribe, obviously, and you would marry into that tribe. And so there was a social process whereby within 39 years, the group that shows up on the doorstep under Joshua, they're Jews. They're just Jews. It's very easy to follow a Jewish lifestyle when you're surrounded by Jews and there's nobody else influencing you. I'm just putting these things out there because sometimes people get weird ideas that can't possibly be, because I've never heard of it, and besides I was told that conversion was wrong. Well, I can't help what other people think, but just the simple meaning of the text would tell you that they were absorbed into the Jewish people. Is that what you wanted me to say? And a one-person different story about the same kind of process is Ruth. Remember, she was a Moabite. Some might say a tribe that was particularly cursed by God. They were not allowed to enter into the temple until like the 10th generation or something like that. I mean, it was serious. Even though, sociologically speaking, they were like kissing cousins. So they were the descendants of Lot, and not the descendants of Abraham so much, but remember, Lot and Abraham came from the same family source. So kissing cousins, we would call them. And the Moabites and several others of the tribes that were along the eastern coast of the Dead Sea, God, because they were cousins, God looked on them, especially not in a positive way, but he said, you must always help your Jewish brethren, your Jewish cousins. That is your job. And when that didn't happen, God was not pleased, and negative things happened to Edomites, to Moabites, to Ammonites. These are all the semi-Jewish relatives from the same family as Abraham. How did I get into that? Oh, Moabites. So remember that there was a famine in Bethlehem, or near Bethlehem, and so the family, the two sons, and the father and mother left their land that was theirs because it had been given to them by God in the lottery, the land lottery that Joshua put forth. And they said, we can't make a living, we're going to go somewhere else where maybe we can make a living. They went to Moab, which is not a long walk. It would be a couple days, 3 days at the most, depending on how you got there. Several different ways to get there. Not far away, like 1,000 miles away. And while they were there, the boys married some Moabite girls. And once again, in the story, there's no judgment on these boys. Be very careful about passing judgment where you're not told that God has passed judgment. Don't assume that you are taking God's side and saying those boys should never have done that. Wow. That's not part of the story either. The main focus of the story is, for a Moabite, Ruth turned into a great Jewish woman. Not just a hanger-on, not just okay, I'll become Jewish if I have to marry a Jewish guy. I'll just give lip service to Judaism. No, she was an enthusiastic supporter of Judaism. And not only did Naomi say this, but the people in Bethlehem who saw her manner of life, who saw how she took care of Naomi, who saw her work ethic, everything about Ruth is exemplary and portrayed her Jewish faith and the morals of her Jewish faith. And remember, there's at one point where Naomi said, "You two girls go back to Mount Moab. I'm just, I have hard luck. I'm never going to be beneficial for you. I'm just going to be a drag. I'm just going to be a load on you. So you girls should go back to your hometowns and marry nice Moabite boys." And the one did, Oprah. Actually, it's Orpah. She went back to Moab. But Ruth said, "Don't ask me to do this. I don't want to go back. I want to be with you. And I want you," she doesn't say, "I want you to be my mother," but she basically says it in poetry. "I want to be in your family, whether or not I'm married to your son." So that is when I would say, we could say, she converted and was no longer a Moabite. Because remember what the blessing was. People love to use this blessing at weddings. It has really nothing to do with weddings. It's about two women, a mom and a daughter. Where you go, I will go. Don't get me started.
Do you want me to finish it?
Yeah.
Okay. Where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. And in that, she made a commitment to the family and the history, the heritage, the religion of Naomi.
And she turned her back on Moab for good. And I don't know what you would call that other than she converted to Judaism. She put her activities into Judaism and supported Judaism and not being Moabite, which was open to her at any time. Does that make sense?
Yep. So, when you next hear it at a wedding, if you do sort of chuckle a little and say, well, this was originally said by the woman to her mother-in-law, can you imagine that being done at a wedding? But anyhow, so Ruth becomes, in one sense, the paradigm.
A personal case study of the mixed multitude that left Egypt. Does everyone know what a case study is? It's where you take one example and you put the microscope on it and you see that as representative of a whole group of people.
And so she becomes a pattern and a paradigm for what a convert looks like, should do, that kind of thing. There's another that I had mentioned quickly in passing, and that comes from the book of Joshua. By the way, Ruth was so included that she became part of the lineage of David, the great king, and therefore the lineage of the Messiah. That's how included she was. Now, Rahab. Most people think of her as the, how should I put, the woman who had a house of ill repute. Is that the way?
Oh yeah, that's what that's the way it's taught. That'd be wrong.
Continue.
The word that is identified as, I think, harlot, and translated in most every single Bible, actually means innkeeper. So she was in charge of the Motel 6 there in Jericho. Just because a woman is in charge of a hotel, remember Jericho is one of the crossroads of the ancient world. Everybody wanted or needed to go through Jericho to get to someplace else in the world that they wanted to be. Armies went through Jericho. Salespeople went through Jericho. And once you have trade and once you have money changing hands and you have overnight visitors, they need a Motel 6 or the equivalent of that. And she was in charge of that. I don't want to say anything about people's dirty minds. I just want to point out that when translating words in the scriptures, you can have examples of words that are mentioned only once in the whole scriptures or twice or three times. And when it's unclear exactly what the meaning of that word is, you would think that the translators would want to go back and get the origins of the word, etc., etc. Yet, in a perfect world, that's what would happen. Except, here's what actually happens. If there's a word used once in the scriptures or twice and it's still unclear what it means in the context, guess where they go to find out what it means? What did everybody else translate it as? What did other versions of the scripture translate this word as? And then they take what everybody else in the past translated the word as. Do you see how that continues a bad problem? Because if these elders in the past didn't get it correct, then current ones will copy it. And therefore, there isn't a lot of actual work done on digging into a word or a root, a three-letter root of a word, and coming up with anything different than what they used to say in 1500. Does that make
Yep.
sense? So, innkeeper, she's an innkeeper. Tell your friends. She ran a hotel. And
What?
she probably ran a bar along with the hotel. As soldiers, soldiers want to drink.
And she is presented in the larger framework of Scripture as you read it more in context, as in contrast with the 10 spies in Numbers chapter 13. They brought back a report that caused the people of Israel to shudder in fear and therefore not want to go into the land. Rahab reflects the exact opposite opinion. In effect, the spies said, this is a people in a land that will eat us up. Rahab says, our people are scared of you because we've heard of, and I talked about this several weeks ago in the Drash. Our people are scared of you because we've seen how God has worked. How God has worked through you. You mean like the Egyptians saw as well? Yes, like the Egyptians saw as well. We've seen how God has worked through you, and you will eat us up.
And she's expressing more faith in God than the
10 spies.
10 spies.
And so, she and her family are spared. And Jewish tradition tells us that she was one of the first converts to Judaism. And guess what? She too ends up as part of the line of the Messiah. You can find her in the genealogical texts. So, exclusionary? Always was intended to be inclusionary. The relationship of non-Jews to the Jewish community was always such that they were welcomed to attach themselves to the Jewish community. So you had what are called the Noachites. You had what were called the God-fearers. And again, that's a whole other subject that we're not going to talk about tonight, but I suggest you read or you reread Dr. Patrice's chapter in The Enduring Paradox called Modern Day God-Fearers. It talks about how these non-Jews were included within the Jewish community.
And attended synagogues regularly and learned and studied about the Tanakh during Yeshua's lifetime and prior to Yeshua's lifetime. It was a normal thing for Gentiles who were interested to go to synagogue services and learn about Judaism.
Another thing that comes in here is if you read the Torah on a regular basis, you will find the Torah telling the people of Israel how you are to respond to the stranger who lives among you, or the foreigner who lives among you. And by the way,
Sometimes translated alien.
alien. This does not have to do with
ET.
with ET. It has to do with the person who's crossed the borders, the immigrant. And if that isn't pointed for our day and age and the way in which we respond or don't respond to these people called immigrants, we are in great danger of being in regular violation of what the Torah says, because these are people who are to be reached out to be brought into, to be taken care of. You can find that in just about every other or third
Something like
selection of the Torah.
60, over 60 times.
In the Torah.
In the Tanakh.
Oh, in the Tanakh. And a good chunk of them, maybe half of them, in the Torah proper itself. So, talk exclusionary, the exact opposite. Now, the question also deals with the idea of leprous or contagious skin diseases, and is well described as a cause for quarantine. Why? Because God was concerned that his people not become the victims of infectious disease, if at all possible. So even that was put in place. Do elaborate on that if you want at all.
No, I just, that the word for leprosy, which the letter writer is correct. It was not leprosy, which we call Hansen's disease nowadays. Like they had, I think, quite a population in the Hawaiian Islands, and they had to have what was used to be called a leper colony there. We can treat that now, but it was probably any kind of skin disease that seemed uncurable at the beginning, and many times was very contagious through touch. I'm going to name one that if you put a toddler into daycare, you've heard about it. Impetigo. Impetigo is a terrible, painful rash that usually toddlers get, and you only get it from touching other toddlers who have it. And so this kind of disease, you have to isolate the sick little toddlers from the well toddlers so that we don't keep passing it around, because although it's not deadly, it's a terrible disease for a child to get. They suffer with it, and this is just one example. We know this is true about measles through touch. You get measles through touch. Mumps, although we don't hear about it now, and I never had them. They've been pretty much eradicated with vaccinations. Those kinds of things. So when we talk about the lepers being pushed outside the city gates, and you have to live outside the city gates with other people with skin diseases, and there's a whole process for, if you think you've been cured, you would go to a priest who, don't pick any old priest, you go to a family that were experts in skin diseases, and have someone from that family who's been trained in skin diseases say, yes, you're done with that, now you can resume your life back in the city walls with your community. Or sometimes you get the bad news of, no, you still need to keep apart. The same kind of thing happened. Okay, now are we all big people? Okay, the same kind of thing happened when women had their periods. From what we understand, a woman who had their period like once a month would go to a special tent or a special building where everybody in it was having their periods. And they used to hang out there for however long their period was, and then when that was done, they would go back to their families. And there's been several novels written about this procedure of women going and living together by themselves, because if everyone's contaminated, quote unquote, you're not contaminating each other. And you're definitely not causing a problem at home, because there are behavioral things that your family needs to know about. I could talk more about that, but I won't. What about the male side? Yeah, there are similar things that men have to do. What? You never heard this? Really? Well, both men and women have body secretions.
Nicely put.
We have body fluids. And sometimes those body fluids are not kept inside ourselves, but they come out. They come out. Oftentimes we have no control over that, especially for men. A lot of times it happens when they sleep. I'm just saying, I've had a lot of men in my family, and I know things. I had a teenage son, I know things. It's just as true for the men who have these body fluids come out of them, that there's a cleansing procedure, just like there is for women who once a month have this issue, which is, thank God for that, or I don't know how reproduction would take place. So let's not make it like women have disgusting body fluids and men don't have disgusting body fluids. No, here's what I say. We all have disgusting body fluids and they all need to be cleaned up according to God. You can't just never take a bath and never wash your sheets, because then you're not cleansing properly like the Bible says. And it's not just women, right? We all have these. And are they cleansable? Absolutely, they are cleansable. Very easy.
Okay. I'm going to say one more thing from the questioner and then use that as a transition into another thing that the questioner brings up. This was to protect the health of others and prevent the spread of such diseases. Exactly. Now, the questioner also brings up the state of impurity that Patrice has been reflecting on, and how, when it's completed, it could be remedied by going through the mikveh. Just as someone could become unclean, they could also become clean again. Do you want to reflect on that in its role?
No, we just talked about it. Oh, you mean, yes. So when we talk about clean and unclean, it's a technical term. It's not about how much laundry detergent you use or the type of laundry detergent or whether you use Lysol or not. It has nothing to do with that. It's because in order to worship in the temple, you had to be clean. And that's why there were 48 mikvahs, 48 mikvahot on the steps to enter the temple in Jerusalem.
And that's just the ones we've uncovered. There may be others we haven't uncovered. Yeah.
Others underneath that. And it can be just as simple as bathing. In other words, you go down and dip your body in water, and then you yourself do it, and then you come up out of the water, and that will cleanse you from any of these messy, unclean situations. And all those are spelled out in great detail in Leviticus, some in Numbers, and we just consider it common sense, don't we, in modern times, that if you are dirty, you will wash, and you will get soap, and you will wash up, and you'll take a shower, and you wash your clothes, and you wash your bedding. This would be normal. This has not been normal in the vast history of the world from different cultures. If you've never read about activities of different cultures, they didn't think that was bad. If you've watched a Western movie, you will recall that even in the United States, back in the 1800s, taking a bath was no big deal, and many people didn't do it. It wasn't necessary. Baths were weird, and you caught a cold from them. So we don't need baths. We're naturally just clean. The body with water, that's weird, and they used to laugh about it in Westerns, or they used to take a bath like once a year, whether they needed it or not. And of course, we think that's a joke because our culture regularly absorbed this concept of cleansing yourself to be acceptable in society, much less to go to the temple and worship. Is that basically?
Yeah, and that relates to something that Patrice expands on in the Torah course. There are states that are mentioned in the Torah. There is holy and unholy. There is clean and unclean. And those are different, how would you describe them? States or statuses before God?
It's a status.
Yeah.
It's a status rather than
Yeah.
they're going to look to see if you have germs. That's not what they're doing. They're looking to see if you have accomplished what God said to do in order to be clean, or not clean as far as, I use the right soap, but clean as far as appropriateness to enter into the temple and worship God in the temple through the sacrifice system.
Okay.
That was way too much. They weren't interested in any of these things.
No, but those are important
So
things.
it's important because we've skipped over these things and we assume that everybody figured that out. No, people didn't figure it out. They just have very strange ideas. very strange ideas. And it's because of ignorance. It's because, get a clue, figure it out. Read the Bible and what it's saying and what it's not saying. If you're unclean, oh no, now you're going to hell, in most people's ideas. No. That has nothing to do with going to hell or not going to hell. It has to do with you need to clean. You need to clean yourself. And you need to wash yourself and your garments and your things in your home, and then go for about 24 hours, and then you're clean again. It doesn't take long, and it's not hard to technically fit into the category of clean in the first 5 books of Moses.
I was going to say something on that. Oh, so as it relates to the question that was brought up and the observations in the question, even this process is not meant to be exclusionary, but to find a way to keep you included.
Solve the problem.
Yes, to solve the problem.
Solve the problem.
To be included in the ongoing functioning of the community.
So that we have the most people who are qualified to worship God.
You could not go into a Gentile's home. Certainly by the time of the Second Temple period, there was an understanding that you could not, as a Jew, eat in a Gentile's home. What? Yeah. Here's the reason, to provide it into its context. There was within the Torah the idea that we were to stay away from dead bodies. It's part of this clean and unclean.
You're not supposed to touch a dead animal body. That would make you unclean.
Let alone a dead human body.
Yeah, that's it.
In many parts of the Roman world, when people's family members or servants died, they got buried where? Not in a graveyard, but on the property of the people. Part 1. Part 2, when Gentiles frequently had dinners, they often did it in the presence of their gods. I mean, literally, because they had the statues there. So if you were to eat in a Gentile's home or to go on into a Gentile's home, depending on the situation, in the one case you may be coming into indirect contact unintentionally with dead people. If you're eating with a Gentile and they, in effect, that dinner is a celebration, ostensibly, to or before their gods, then by joining them in that process, you are in fact engaging in idolatry. So, to eat in Gentile homes, in general, was a problem on one or two possible fronts. And so the Jews of that time period, certainly by the Second Temple period, were instructed not to do that so as to not miscommunicate what this was all. They knew that the idols weren't anything, but if you show up in such a situation, as the rabbi argues in 1 Corinthians 8 to 10, then what you're doing is you are, in a sense, misleading people into thinking that you think that this is okay and that idolatry is okay. Fair enough?
But that doesn't necessarily mean then that Jews and Gentiles could not eat together.
Oh, no. Exactly.
See, people take it even further, and they couldn't eat together. And then there's that little kerfuffle in Acts, where Rav Shaul sort of reprimands Peter. Galatians 2, that's why I have him here. He's Mr. New Covenant Greek guy. And what does Rav Shaul say to Peter?
It's in that particular point that because of some of the people that had come into that situation, in a sense, Peter or Shimon takes a step back and he does not eat with the Gentiles in that case. And Rav Shaul reprimands him for exactly that. That he was in that sense being, what's the term he used? He didn't use the term hypocritical.
No.
But it's something akin to that.
It's not flattering.
Yeah.
It's
He-
almost like legalistic.
Oh, it relates to, the whole issue is legalistic. No, he just simply says, I opposed him to his face because he was clearly in the wrong. Okay. Because certain people had come, claiming to have come from James. And it says, he, Shimon, used to eat with the Gentiles, but when they arrived, he drew back.
When James came?
No, when these people who
When
claimed to be from
Oh,
James
okay.
came,
All right.
he drew back. And, he did use hypocrisy, and others joined him in this hypocrisy.
So what was the hypocrisy specifically?
The hypocrisy is that previously they had eaten with
Eating
Gentiles.
together.
And now
Now
when
when
this
these
group
guys
came,
showed up,
they
they
were
didn't.
ultra
Well,
legalistic.
no, we never eat
Yeah.
with them.
Yeah.
Nonsense. People don't do any of these things nowadays.
Okay, so, more in Galatians. If you're interested, you'll need to either take the course in a couple of years on the epistles from a Jewish perspective, or you need to go get get it as a, I know these are commercials, as a distance course, if you don't want to wait a couple of years. How did I get into that?
I don't remember.
Oh, because it was referenced that some people thought that the Torah said you could not go to a Gentile's home. No. Traditions in the certainly in the Second Temple period, did have these instructions that I've referenced, and they had these instructions to enable people to be more fully in compliance with the Torah's instructions as to how to maintain the state of cleanness. And it had nothing to do with being with Gentiles. It had to be with the situation in which, in that case, specific situation of eating, you were conveying the wrong message because of the idolatry connection.
Boy, that was long.
Okay. I said this, there were a lot of good questions and observations that were part of this. So we go to the next one. Also, the concept of being free from the law. Were there not multiple meanings and contexts for the word law in the Newer Testament? Two off the top of my head are law referring to the Torah and law referring to legalism. Is it possible that these two concepts are being mixed up in the statement free from the law? And whenever that phrase comes up, we always think of it.
The parody song, used to be a hymn,
Yes.
and you just change the last line, and you hear something funny. So here was the hymn. Free from the law, oh happy condition. I can sin as I want and still have remission.
And that was the line of the hymn which Romans chapter 6 expressly speaks against. If rather than paraphrase what he says, because he says it so well, the rabbi does. What shall we say then? Shall we go on sinning so that grace may increase?
Good idea.
That's exactly
That's
what
a good idea.
That's exactly
If I sin more, then I get more grace.
more grace. And that's what he's answering here. And I want to go into Romans 6 in just a minute. But yes, there were multiple meanings and usages and contexts for the term nomos that is used as a translation of law. Two things, first of all. Number one, Torah. From what nomos translates does not mean law. Sitting next to me is a morah. A moreh.
No, I'm a moron.
I got it right the first time. A morah, yes.
That's
Morah,
what you-
Torah. She's a teacher of the Torah. She's a what? A lawyer. No, she is a teacher. The term Torah, as the term morah, or me as a moreh, me refers to the one who teaches. So Torah means teaching or instruction. It does not mean law. Nomos was the translation of Torah, Hebrew into Greek, And but nomos had a greater variety of meanings. In fact, in Romans chapter 7, the next chapter from Romans 6, I counted at least half a dozen different uses of this term nomos. And it could be anything from what we would call natural law, or the law, scientific law,
Gravity.
like gravity,
Is a law.
to legal principles, could refer to Torah, or it could refer to this whole concept of legalism, which says there are certain things I must do in order to either get into relationship with God or to improve my relationship with God. And it places the emphasis on the wrong thing, and it turns the Torah into something it is not. It turns the Torah into something of a law code rather than a treaty or a covenant that God made with his people, instructing them how to have a relationship with him. So, free from the law? No. But Romans chapter 6, verse 14 and following in that section does, if you read it out of context, out of the larger context of what I've already given you part of, but also the context of Romans 6 and 7, it says, "For sin shall not be your master, because you're not under law, but under grace." That is probably one of the places from which this concept of free from the law is derived. And in fact, when you get commentary on some of these passages, you get that kind of misunderstanding. But the context of this paragraph is, in the same way, count yourself as dead to sin but alive to God in the Messiah. So don't let sin reign in your mortal body, so that you obey its evil desires. In other words, you are being then obedient to what is called in Romans 7 the law of sin, in that you're following that set of principles that you must do instead of following what God has said. But it says, don't offer yourselves as instruments, your body to sin as instruments of wickedness, but offer yourselves to God, to those who've been brought from death to life. The previous paragraph had talked about how we've been identified with Yeshua in his death, in his burial, in his resurrection to a new life. That's the context. So in that larger context, you can't then all of a sudden say, and so you're free from the law. That's not what it's talking about. He's talking about how you can be free from what? From sin. And then it does pick up with what it began with in the beginning of the chapter. What shall we say then? Shall we sin because we're not under law but under grace? And he says, if I might paraphrase, no way, Jose. So that's where that particular text comes from. There is further stuff that is derived from Romans 7, first paragraph, how it seems to say you are free from the law as well. But I'm not going to get into that because we've already spent plenty of time on this particular part of the question. I will simply refer to the fact that I did an article that's now it's a chapter in the book on this, and because I don't remember the exact title, give me 30 seconds to find it.
He'll be right back, I think. I don't know what he's looking for. Our library is right there,
Okay.
our giant library.
It is found in Chaye Yisrael, a festschrift in honor of Rabbi Elliot Klayman, and Patrice contributed a chapter to this as well. But the article that I'm now referencing is, as I'm looking it up in the table of contents, or the chapter is Law in Romans, an interpretive proposal. Law in Romans, an interpretive proposal. You can get the book. It's published as part of the journal Kesher, or you can find it on the Menorah Ministries website, menorahministries.com. That was a commercial. So the Law in Romans, an interpretive proposal, that deals with Romans chapter 7 and its misunderstood contribution to this whole question. And then we're still not done with this wonderful set of questions that comes from the questioner. I have also heard a statement that the Pharisees were imposing extra laws on top of the laws of the Torah, which caused the people to be oppressed. Where is this notion coming from? The notion is coming from a misunderstanding of the Pharisees and a misunderstanding of the law. We've dealt with part of the misunderstanding of the law, and now I want to spend some time dealing with and feel free to hop in on this one, misunderstanding concerning Pharisees. Again, in its historical context, the Pharisees were those, as you study them, who were there, consistently tried to help the people to be more in compliant with the Torah.
Faithful.
Thank you, more faithful to God and to the Torah.
Could explain the Torah so that they could understand how they should be faithful.
Exactly. Because the questions often arose, okay, we're now living, if you're in the time of Yeshua, we're now living 1,400 years after the time of Moses. Things have changed. How do we do things? How do we express this now in our day and age? And the Pharisees were there to answer those questions, as they had been in previous years and centuries. They had been around for probably close to a couple hundred years before Yeshua. So that was their role, and the people looked to them as guides to help them, to help enable them to be more consistent in following the Torah. So they didn't make it more difficult for people to follow the Torah. They were making it more easy for people to follow the Torah. And that's a gross misunderstanding of the Pharisees that it often continues to this day. And as Patrice and I have talked about it before, one of the most insidious avenues towards anti-Semitism is the avenue of the Pharisees. They become a how should we put it, a springboard into either latent or overt, thank you, that's what I was looking for, or overt anti-Semitism, because the transition is so easily made from Pharisees to Jews, or to Judaism to Jews. So you go from being anti-Pharisaic to becoming anti-Judaistic to anti-Jewish. And one of these days we will still write a book on that and on some of the related issues. Go ahead before I
I was going to say, Christian seminaries
yeah.
have not caught up with the modern 21st century idea of what was going on during Yeshua's lifetime in the Jewish community. These pastors, I don't know where they have gone to seminary or school, but they really have a wrong-headed idea about what Pharisees did every day and what Sadducees did every day and how they're totally different and they disagreed with each other every day. But scholars keep writing books and articles that say the Pharisees are the good guys, the Sadducees are the bad guys in Yeshua's world. Now, why does Yeshua yell at Pharisees if they're the good guys? Because, and this is true, I think, about teaching in general, when someone who should know better says wrong things, says misguided things, says stupid things, you're more disappointed than if the dumbest person in the class says that. You expect the smartest people in your class to be above that and to do much better. Yeshua was discouraged because the Pharisees were saying dumb, some Pharisees said dumb and stupid things that didn't even agree with being a Pharisee. And he had to correct them because they were at the top of the heap and people like the Sadducees were at the bottom of the heap. And there was no help for the Sadducees. He could preach at them all day and all night, and they wouldn't hear what he said at all. Is that fair enough?
That, yes, and let me elaborate on that just a bit. By the way, there was an excellent book written by Rabbi Harvey Falk, F-A-L-K, called Jesus the Pharisee. Yes, Jesus was a Pharisee. Yeshua was a Pharisee. He was that and more, but he definitely was that.
And if you and I were living during the time of the Pharisees, we would have been proud to be Pharisees.
And that's what I want to get to in just a second here. Not only was Yeshua a Pharisee, so also was the person who became known historically as the Apostle Paul, Rav Shaul.
He was definitely a Pharisee.
And it wasn't that he used to be a Pharisee. In the book of Acts, he says on several occasions, I am a Pharisee, and that was after the road to Damascus. But again, that's part of the course next year around this time, Jewish Roots and Foundations of Scripture, Part 2. At the time of Yeshua and prior to the time of Yeshua, there were two main houses or schools of Pharisees. There was the house or the school of Hillel and the house or the school of Shammai. And they would often enter into fierce debate, one with another, over all kinds of issues. Now, of those two schools of Pharisees during Yeshua's time, the school of Pharisees that was in prominence because they were very prevalent within the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was the ruling religious body of the Jewish people in the Second Temple period. It goes back to before then. It goes on after then, but that's a whole other story we don't have time for now. But in the Sanhedrin, it was run by the high priest and his family or his relatives and his allies, who were basically the Sadducees, and there were also a bunch of Pharisees there, and the Pharisaic group that was there was the Shammaites. Now, the Hillelites disagreed with the Shammaites. Yeshua disagrees with the Pharisees. You can't say he disagrees with the Pharisees unless you're more specific. Which group of Pharisees does he disagree with? And as it turns out, well over 90% of the time, he comes down on the side of the Hillelites in opposition to the Shammaites. So, when Yeshua is, as the Gospels indicated, arguing with the Pharisees, he's arguing with a group of the Pharisees, not all of the Pharisees. Part 1. Part 2. In Matthew chapter 23, you have a long list of Yeshua's negative statements about the Pharisees and their hypocrisy. So that Pharisees are considered hypocrites. In fact, if you look up Pharisee in the dictionary even to this day, guess what you're going to find as the primary definition? Hypocrite. But here's what's not understood.
That's its meaning in English.
The main literary production of the Pharisees, who then later became known as the rabbis of the late Second Temple period and thereafter, is what is called the Talmud. And in the Talmud also deals with the Pharisees. If you want to be precise, if I remember it correctly, it's in the tractate Sotat, sections 21 and 22. And in there, 7 types of Pharisees are mentioned. And 5 of them are mentioned negatively. This was written by Pharisees, and it points out the hypocrisy of some of those who lived among them. And it talks in even stronger terms than you find in Matthew chapter 23. So the Pharisees criticized the hypocrites among them in even stronger language than did Yeshua. But again, he was dealing with not all Pharisees were hypocrites. Number one, he was dealing with the hypocrites, and largely he was disagreeing with the Shammaites just as the Hillelites did. And then you have Yeshua's statements that undercut most of this discussion. He says in Matthew 23, verses 2 and 3, whatever the Pharisees teach, do it. So if you're going to be anti-Pharisaic, you have now become anti-Yeshua. Is that straightforward enough? And in fact, in Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 to 20, where he says, I have not come to set aside the Torah or the prophets, but to fulfill them, 3 verses later he says, unless your righteousness, unless your behavior exceeds even that of the Pharisees, your status in the kingdom of heaven will be suspect. Now, if the Pharisees were as they are often described even to this day in religious circles, including in Messianic Jewish religious circles, if they are the scum of the earth, to say you should live, your lifestyle should be better than the lifestyle of the scum of the earth,
It already is.
it already is. What have you said? But if the Pharisees were, as they were respected in those days, the pattern for piety, then he's saying, go to the very top and exceed even that if you're going to be a follower of mine.
But they're free from the law.
Yes.
So they don't have to do that.
So they don't have to do that. And I want to leave you with 2 names here. Nicodemus. He is described as a good guy in John chapter 3. He was a Pharisee. In Acts chapter 5, one of the you were going to say something there?
I was going to say, well, it just skips the part where he repents of his Pharisaism
Oh, right.
and follows Yeshua. I'm
And fo-
sure that's in there somewhere.
Somewhere.
But it was dropped out.
Yeah, John chapter 3.5. That's like, what is, in Harry Potter, what's the station?
Oh, 9 3/4?
Yes, that's like station 9 3/4 in Harry Potter's
Yeah.
world. If you don't understand that, you got to go read the texts. Where was I? Oh, the Pharisees as the good guys. Nicodemus was certainly one of them. And in fact, he's mentioned in glowing terms not only in the biblical text, but also in the rabbinic text, in the Talmud. One of the major Pharisaic leaders, one of the major rabbis of the Second Temple period was Gamaliel. He's mentioned in Acts chapter 5. He's a teacher of Rav Shaul. And he stands up for the apostles in Acts chapter 5, and in effect describes what they are doing as stuff from God. He says if it wasn't from God, then it would disappear of its own. And there is even some understanding or some traditions in Jewish history, and I get into this in the course, where it's quite possible that Gamaliel actually and his family actually became Messianic Jews. But that's not part of our response here. I just want to share that with you. And the book of Acts indicates that many of the Pharisees became followers of Yeshua. Certainly Acts chapter 21 indicates that. So much for the Pharisees, and thank you for that wonderful set of not just questions, but observations. There was an interesting one that came in just recently, and I think...
Which one of these? The first one? Oh, yeah, that's
Yeah,
fine.
well, actually, they're all sort of interrelated.
They're interrelated.
Yes.
So, new topic.
Yes, this came in recently, very recently. So we got one from a month ago, now one from in the last couple of days. And I like the way this begins. Welcome home and soon bon voyage. Well, that's because I'm not sure bon voyage is the right term. We'll be heading off to a conference of the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations starting on Tuesday.
We're going to Columbus, Ohio. Wow.
So, bon voyage.
And work. We're going there to work.
So while you are here, please answer these questions if you will. All right. And these are interrelated. There are 3 of them. What's the difference between Sheol, or Sheol, depending on who's pronouncing it, Hades, Gehenna, Tartarus, and the lake of fire? Do you want to reflect on any of those terms to start with?
Well, I can tell you about Sheol. Sheol is mentioned many times in the Older Testament. It's understood to be the place where when you're dead, you don't go to heaven or hell. These concepts of heaven and hell are not here in the scripture. Here's the concept they had of the afterlife, the Jewish people, Sheol. And Sheol is seen as sometimes it's personified as a jail. It's not a jail, but it is a room that you cannot leave on your own volition. And we're unsure where it is. So the souls of dead people, for lack of a better term at this point, go to Sheol. And they're all gathered there in Sheol. And Sheol, we don't know where it is. It's not like heaven where it's up in the sky, or hell, it's down underneath the ground. We don't know where Sheol is. But the place that many assume it was at that point was under the oceans. And that's part of the reason that they can't get out of Sheol, is in the oceans. Well, then what happens to them? They just wait in like this waiting area. And my understanding is they wait for the Messiah to come and release them. So when it talks about Sheol, which it does in the Psalms, it does in several of the written prophets, Sheol is what happens to you in the afterlife. There's not a division between heaven and hell, and you have to go to heaven or you have to go to hell. And Sheol is not hell. It's not a place of eternal torment. It's not like that at all. You could see it more as an airport waiting area. You're waiting for your flight. But the flight doesn't come until the Messiah returns. The other one I can deal with is Gehenna. So
Okay,
do you
go
want
ahead.
to deal with some of these others?
Yes, let me get to Hades. Hades is a Greek term that often translate the Hebrew Sheol.
Yes, Sheol is the Hebrew
Yeah,
name.
and Hades-
is the Greek name.
And just for the fun of it, and in fact, Hades then is the term that the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Older Testament, uses for Sheol. And just for the fun of it, I thought I'd look up one of my apps on the cell phone and see what this app had to say.
He's so with
And this is not Google, by the way. Hades concept: that which is out of sight, a Greek word used to denote the state or place of the dead. The state or the place, not as in state as in Michigan or Wisconsin or Florida, but
status.
or the place of the dead. All the dead alike go into this place. To be buried, to go down to the grave, to descend into Hades are equivalent expressions. In the Septuagint, this word is the usual rendering of the Hebrew Sheol, the common receptacle of the departed.
Like the airplane gate at the airport, those waiting for their flight.
Okay, so now, Gehenna.
All right. Gehenna is another Greek term for the place where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. And it's a great story about where Gehenna comes from. That's the translation into Greek. Into the original Hebrew, it was Gehinnom. Gehinnom. Ge means valley of, and Hinnom means Hinnom. Now the Hinnom River, which is, very not quite accurate, because it'd be more like a wadi or a river that flowed north and south in the city of Jerusalem, right next to the walls of the city of Jerusalem. So if you came to the walls of the city on the west side of the city and you looked over, you'd be looking into the Valley of Hinnom. The Valley of Hinnom, and people would know that. What is that? That's the Valley of Hinnom. It became quite a terrible place. During the time of the kings, there were worshipers of the foreign god Molech. And the foreign god Molech, the way you worship him, the way you would sacrifice to him, is that you would give him one of your babies. And so here's what you would do. So there's a big, stone or made out of blocks place that had this furnace going, and it had like a slide at a pool, and you would put your baby at the top of the pool, at the top of the slide, and it would slide down automatically into the fire. And then you have sacrificed to Moloch. Isn't that charming and nice? It's wonderful, isn't it? And believe it or not, there was actually a king who did sacrifice his baby to the god Moloch. Yeah, it was Manasseh. Now, where was this shrine and this sacrifice place? It was in the Hinnom Valley, And so it became known as the place of screaming and crying, and it was extremely hot, and people were tortured there. So are you getting sort of a plan? So this Gehinnom in Greek then becomes Gehenna, and it becomes a signifier of a place that was hideously cruel and mean, and there was always fires burning. Now, after Manasseh's time, that shrine to Molech was destroyed, but in the Middle East during ancient times, they didn't bring in a bulldozer and take the rubble away. They left the rubble there. And so people started making it into like a garbage dump. So they showed contempt for where this temple to Molech was by throwing garbage on it. Well, you're in the Middle East. It does not rain for 7 months in a row, and that's normal. And what happens to garbage that lays out in the sun when there's no rain to put out the fires? The fires continue. So you have another aspect of how horrible Gehinnom is. A time of screaming and crying, a time of death, and also a place where the fire never goes out. So now you get a picture of why the Greeks would call the evil place where people go, not Sheol, this is a different place, but the place where evil is would be Gehenna. And it's based on the term, the Valley of Hinnom. And you can go to the Valley of Hinnom today, and let me tell you, it's a very nice place to go, because it's now, after the Muslim people came in and conquered Jerusalem, they made it into a pool, nice beautiful pool, calm pool, and it was called for a long time Sultan's Pool. So it would collect rainwater when it rained in the spring and in fall, and it was like a lovely pool. After 1947, the pool is dried up, and so what the Israelis did with the pool that's really in Gehinnom is they made like a, what do you call that?
Arena?
An arena out of it where you can have, they have a stage, and then you have seating that goes around the valley. And when I was there one summer, Ray Charles came and was on the stage there, and that was called Sultan's Arena or something. They named it after the Sultan. So it's very nice to go there now. Ray Charles was there. Bob Dylan came when I was there. Barbara Streisand came and did a concert. It's a very nice place to have a concert. So if you're world famous, you can have a concert at the place that used to be called Hell. But, you know, most people don't know the story behind it, but now you do. So that's Gehenna. And that it wasn't used until Greek-speaking times. And it was developed out of a Hebrew phrase. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And just to be clear, those concerts you mentioned were not concerts from hell.
No, they were really good concerts. Ray Charles loved Israel.
But you can now see how, given that historical context, how it could connect with this last phrase, lake of fire. I want to deal with...
Fire is never extinguished.
Yeah. Let me see.
Oh, you're looking up Tartarus?
I had looked it up, and now I can't find where I found it. It was in one of the texts that was,
You think this kind of stuff doesn't happen to us? It happens to us.
okay, good.
Good, you found it?
Yeah,
First Peter?
yeah. Let me deal with Tartarus next and then get back to Lake of Fire. Where are the angels who sinned imprisoned according to 2 Peter 2:4? So that's what I was looking up. If God did not spare angels when they sinned, but sent them to hell, and the Greek term there is not Gehenna, but is Tartarus, putting them into gloomy dungeons to be held for judgments. If he did not spare the ancient world and so forth, but brought on it the flood on its ungodly people, but protected Noah, and then he goes on to the discussion there. Okay, now, I think there was also something of a note on it. Yeah, here it is. I'm now reading from the NIV Study Bible. This sometimes provides you, a lot of times, with good notes. So since they deal with it very well. Tartarus was the term used by the Greeks to designate the place where the most wicked spirits were sent to be punished. Why some evil spirits are imprisoned and others are free to serve Satan as demons is not explained in Scripture. So that's a nice, quick description of where Tartarus comes into it. Tartarus becomes another term that's used to speak of what is often called hell, and in fact, in most translations, it is translated
But
as
it's a
hell.
place of punishment.
It's a place of punishment, and it's a special, would you want to call it maybe, in modern prison terms, the security top, what's it called?
No. Yeah, the top security and most
Yeah. the top-
dangerous prisoners go
Yeah,
there.
top security, most dangerous prison go there.
Yeah,
So,
it's got a phrase, but I don't know.
yeah, there's a phrase for it, and I've lost that phrase too. So that's in answer to the second question. Where are the angels who sinned imprisoned? They're imprisoned in hell in this sense, but specifically Tartarus, and that's how this Greek term was understood by the larger population in those days. And I think because the authors of Scripture used that term, then it means that term helped to communicate even to a Jewish community this broader concept. Now on to the lake of fire. This is Revelation chapter 20. It begins with verse 11. It's a great white throne judgment, as it's often called, because he says, I saw a great white throne and him who was seated on it, and then he pronounced judgment. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne. The books were opened, and another book was opened called the Book of Life. The dead were judged according to what they had done as recorded in the books. The sea gave up the dead that were in it, and death and Hades, got it? Death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them, and each person was judged according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. Okay? In other words, again, Revelation is what's called an apocalyptic piece of literature, and apocalyptic literature used, without getting bogged down into what apocalyptic literature was, used pictures and images and metaphors to describe what are often called end-time realities. So, this is a picture or a metaphor. Given what we already know about death and Hades, how can that be thrown into a lake of fire? This again is an image that's being presented here. Lake of fire is the second death. If anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, they were thrown into the lake of fire. Book of life is a Jewish concept that goes back a long way into the Old Testament. We're not going to get into that. So that's how these things interrelate. So when it's said, when the third question is, what is the second death according to Scripture? It is what is now called here the lake of fire.
That's
Hang on.
Revelation 20.
20:11 to where did I end? 15th. Now, let me, in the previous chapter, okay, I'm now picking up at chapter 19, verse 19. I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to make war against the rider on the horse and his army. But the beast was captured, and with him the false prophets who performed the miraculous signs on his behalf. With these signs he had deluded those who had received the mark of the beast and worshipped his image. The two of them were thrown alive into the fiery lake of burning sulfur. Sure sounds like a lake of fire. All right, so this beast, or what's often called the Antichrist of the book of Revelation, is located here, and apparently it is somewhat, I'm going to suggest that it's somewhat connected with Tartarus, because the people of Tartarus certainly ended up here, and that's what you find regarding the lake of fire in the book of Revelation. Now, I want to say one final thing. Why is it called the second death? My suggestion is this the Revelation 20 is virtually the last chapter of the book of the Bible. I'm going to go back to one of the first chapters of the book of the Bible, Genesis chapter 2. And Genesis chapter 2 talks about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And it says, if you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will die. That's the first death.
That's human death.
But I'm going to suggest it's broader than that.
Okay.
It's human death, but it has to do with the death of a close relationship with God. So it has to do with what's often called not just being separated from life, but being separated from God. So just as the first death goes back to the beginning of human death, but also to a severance in the relationship with God, so I'm going to suggest that since the book of Revelation is so packed full of references, allusions, and hits to all of Scripture, that the second death therefore refers to the conclusion of that matter. The end of death, but also has a reference to those who now end their lives being separated from God, just as the first death seemed to reference as well. Does that make sense? So that's why it's called the second death. So hopefully we've come full circle, except for the fact that we've dabbled in the book of Revelation, and all kinds of questions arise from Revelation, including the other question that we were asked to deal with that we are not going to deal with because we don't have the time.
Not this time.
Not this time. Is it possible to briefly discuss the sequence of events that will take place when Yeshua returns? I have found eschatology or end times confusing. Could you cover the 144,000? Guess where they show up? They show up in the book of Revelation, and these sequence of events that are being asked about are also found, among other places, in the book of Revelation. So what we've done is we have come all the way to set the stage for the next question we're going to deal with, but that's next time.
Do we know what date that is going to be?
Yes, I believe we do. I'm going to guess at it from my
Gonna be
calendar.
August?
Yes, it is in August.
Yeah, this is the only time we're meeting in July.
All right, I'll jump the month of August. I think that we are meeting not the second and the fourth Saturdays as we usually do, but this time we're meeting the first and the third. Okay, which means the 5th and the 19th. So we will next meet August 5th. So 5th and the 19th. And deep breath. Any questions on what we've gone through? In fact, we've lost at least one of our listeners along the process, 2 of them, but hey, at least they were not cast into the lake of fire.
As far as we know.
As far as we know.
We have no definitive answer on that.
Okay. No questions? Then how soon can we end? Now that we've described when we are next meeting, we can end. Would you close for us in prayer, my dear?
Avinu Malkeinu, our Father and our King, we thank you that we can look into your scriptures and we can glean wisdom out of it. Help us when we read to understand and to clearly see your path throughout history and even in our own individual lives. Father, help us to follow you more closely day by day and week by week. Be with us as we encounter things that are scary and possibly dangerous. Father, help us to know that you are with us during those times. We thank you for leading us and guiding us throughout our lives. We ask for safety and health for those that we care for. And we pray that you continue to see that we're on the right path as we walk day by day. B'Shem Yeshua Meshachenu, in the name of Yeshua, our Messiah. Amen.
Okay. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being patient with us. And thank you for taking the journey from Revelation through